What's up, everybody? So, assume by this point everybody knows, but about the sad news of the passing of Moshe Lashinsky last night. After Maariv, tonight beginning at 6:30, the Hespedim will be here, and afterwards the Kfura will be at Haram Nuchot for those who want to go. Also, just to let you know that as a result of the circumstances, the lecture that was going to take place tomorrow night will not take place tomorrow night. So that's been postponed indefinitely until a more opportune and appropriate time. And we should hear good news. So in a few minutes we have until Maariv. Let's talk a little bit coming up to Rosh Chodesh Adar this weekend, Parashat Shkalim, and that means that Purim is not very far away. And as you all know, Purim this year is very unusual because we have in Yerushalayim, we have Purim Meshulash. Essentially, Purim falls out on Shabbat, Tetvav falls out on Shabbat, and since that is the case, we cannot do most of the things we normally would do on Shabbat, so it's split up. Some of the mitzvot we perform on Friday, some of the mitzvot we do on Sunday. We have to see what exactly is left for Purim on Shabbat itself as well. But let's talk a little bit about maybe the main mitzvah of Purim, which is Mikra Megillah. Mikra Megillah, and that is certainly not done on Shabbat. The Mishnah, right at the beginning of Masechet Megillah, tells us that when you have what happens if Yudalit or Tevav, if it falls on Shabbat, then the reading of the Megillah is brought forward to the previous days, brought forward to Friday. So Yudalit is not going to fall out on Shabbat in our fixed calendar, but Tevav, as we know, as it does this year, can fall out on Shabbat, and therefore we have this whole story. So the first question is, why is it that we don't read? Why is that we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat? So the Gemara gives two answers. In fact, the Bavli gives two answers. The Yerushalmi gives a different answer. There are a number of different approaches to this. So the Gemara, the Bavli Megillah Daftar Lamed Bet says, "There's Megillah b'Shabbat lo karina." We don't read the Megillah on Shabbat. Why? Ma'itama Maraba Akol chayavin b'kriyat Megillah ve'ein akol b'kiyin b'mikra Megillah. It says Rabbah, and this should sound familiar because Rabbah says the same svara a number of times in Shas. He says everybody needs to read the Megillah. Everybody needs to at least hear the Megillah. But not everybody knows how to read the Megillah. So what are you going to do, right? So there's a gzera because a person somebody who doesn't know how to read the Megillah might take his Megillah Esther to go to somebody who knows how, and he's going to go to learn how. And what's going to happen is he's going to carry it. He's going to carry it on Shabbat through the Yavirenu Abba Amot Reshut Harabim. He's going to carry it 4 Amot in Reshut Harabim, and he's going to transgress the prohibition of carrying on Shabbat. I remember a few years ago, I was here, but a few years ago in the days of COVID, and we weren't allowed to, there were different stages of lockdown, we weren't allowed to come to shul or not come to shul. So everybody was asking the question, right, could you hear the Megillah over Zoom or something like that? Simple answer is no. Unless there are extenuating circumstances, and that's hopefully not going to be relevant again. But so there were different. Not everybody could get to shul; it wasn't possible. So if you have a klaf at home, I remember there were certain places they made videos of instructions of how to read the Megillah, and then there was even one. It's a very, very long video going pasuk by pasuk, where you would hear the pasuk being read, and then there was a gap. And you could say your pasuk, so you could watch the video, and then you could read the Megillah at home. Obviously, you can't do that on Shabbos, but that's the point. A person needs to learn. So Rabbah says, there's a Chachamim made a gzera that in order that somebody shouldn't carry the Megillah by accident on Shabbat, therefore you won't carry it. Now, v'hainu tamad de shofar, v'hainu tamad de lulav. I said this reason of Rabbah. This is very familiar to us because we know when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar on the day of Rosh Hashanah, which is Shabbat, for the exact same reason, because somebody might go and carry the shofar through Reshut Harabim on Shabbat and carry it 4 Amot. Same thing when it comes to Netilat Lulav. First day of Yom Tov is on Shabbat. We don't have Lulav. So what's interesting, by the way, is that by shofar and Lulav over there, okay, there are more days of the Chag, or there's 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, but it's the Rabbanan. But nonetheless, you don't fulfill the mitzvah, and Chachamim uprooted it there. Here, we're saying you don't read the Megillah on Shabbat, but nonetheless, you would read it on Friday. Okay, and we'll see why. But that is the reason. That is the reason of Rabbah. He says we're concerned about somebody may come to transgress Shabbat by carrying the Megillah. Now, there's a second reason, And the Rishonim discuss, is the second reason arguing with the first reason? Is this adding to the first reason? Whatever it is. But Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef Amar mipnei she'eineihem shel aniyim nesuot b'mikra Megillah. Because the eyes of the poor people, they raise their eyes to the reading of the Megillah. What does it mean? In other words, we have, alongside the mitzvah of Mikra Megillah, we have the mitzvah of Matanot Le'Evyonim, of giving to the poor. And everybody knows that when you're reading the Megillah, that's the time when there's going to be you're going to be giving to the poor as well. You can see the lines outside shul or inside shul, right? And therefore, on Shabbat, obviously we can't give Matanot Le'Evyonim. On Shabbat, you can't give out money, you can't give out tzedakah. And therefore, so as not to cause that, Rav Yosef says we don't read the Megillah on Shabbat. Okay, I mentioned, by the way, the Yerushalmi gives a different reason for all of these. Meaning the reason of Rabbah that we don't perform these mitzvot on Shabbat because we might come to carry it. Yerushalmi has different explanations for all of them. So by shofar, for example, it says by shofar we have one pasuk that says Yom Trua and we have one pasuk that says Zichron Trua. So the Yerushalmi says the pasuk that says Yom Trua is talking about Rosh Hashanah and Chol, Zichron Trua is on Shabbat. Okay, more to discuss there, but not for now. And regarding Purim, so the Yerushalmi says this. It says Chal Tetvav Liot b'Shabbat Lekrot b'Megillat Esther Ein Ata Yachol She'en Korin b'Kitvei HaKodesh Ela Min HaMincha U'Lemala. That there was at a certain time there was a gzera not to read from the Kitvei HaKodesh on Shabbat morning, because that was the time of the drasha, and that was the time in order that it shouldn't cause bitul Beit HaMidrash, that people shouldn't be going and therefore Chachamim made a gzera that instead of learning, people are going to be reading these things, right? So therefore you can't read Kitvei HaKodesh until after Mincha. In any event, those are some of the different explanations. Now, there's a number of questions that some of the Rishonim raise relating to this idea and these gzerot, this idea of not reading and not fulfilling these mitzvot on Shabbat. Okay, we go back to the explanation of Rabbah, which is essentially what we accept the halakha, that it's related to the fact that a person might transgress Shabbat, might come to carry on Shabbat instead of in order to fulfill these mitzvot. So the Ritva asks the following question. He says, why is it only for these mitzvot which are related to Yom Tov? There's other mitzvot that you could do on Shabbat that you could come to transgress as well. For example, he says Brit Milah. Why don't we make in the same way that Chachamim came and made a gzerah? They said there is no tkiyat shofar on Shabbat, even though there's a mitzvah to eat tkiyat shofar on Rosh Hashanah, even though there's the mitzvah of netilat lulav on Sukkot, right? But we say Chachamim can uproot that with Shei V'al Taseh. They say don't fulfill that mitzvah because you might transgress Shabbat. So why don't you say the same thing when it comes to Brit Milah? There's a Brit Milah on Shabbat. Maybe you're going to come and carry the knife. Maybe you're going to come and carry the second. It's the same thing. So he gives a number of answers. And the Ritva says, over there it's different. It's by Brit Milah, the mitzvah itself is an isur, which is nidcheh because of Shabbat. The very act of Brit Milah, that itself would not be allowed on Shabbat. It's only allowed because the Torah said it has to be B'Yom HaShmini on the 8th day, so that falls on Shabbat. And therefore he says that we don't add an gzerah when the Torah itself already said you can perform what would have been an isur. Chachamim are not going to come and say no because we're worried about another. That's one question. There's another question which many raise, which is the following: say you're concerned on Rosh Hashanah, we'll say that we'll uproot the Chachamim took away the mitzvah of Tkiyat Shofar because a person might come to transgress when it's on Shabbat. So what about when Rosh Hashanah is not on Shabbat? Right, blowing a shofar, playing musical instruments on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, that's asur. That's asur because you might come to, they might break, you might come to fix them. There's a gzerah in the end of Masechet Beitzah. So why don't we say that you can't, right? You can't blow the shofar when it's Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat. Maybe you can't blow the shofar any time on Rosh Hashanah because there would have been an isur. So again, the Rishonim over there explain that the Chachamim made this gzerah when it's going to uproot the mitzvah on certain instances, on certain occasions. But if we're going to uproot the mitzvah completely, meaning you're not going to blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbat. But if we're going to say you're not going to blow you still have the mitzvah of shofar. You have it other years, you have it the other day. If we're going to say that you can't blow the shofar at all, so you've completely uprooted the mitzvah, so that we don't. So those are two questions Those are two questions that come up in relation to this Gezerah, and that is one of the answers that's given. But I heard another answer, which Rav Rimon brings in a couple of his Sfarim. Very interesting suggestion, which relates to both of these questions, and maybe gives a different answer, which is as follows. Again, the question was, why do we say we've seen the Chachamim made a Gezerah? They said Purim falls on Shabbat, so don't read the Megillah on Shabbat because you might come to carry it. The question number one was, there are other mitzvot that relate to Shabbat where you might come to carry, but we don't cancel them. Question number two was, there are other circumstances in terms of Yom Tov where you have reasons to cancel the mitzvot, but we don't do either of those. So the explanation he gives is as follows. He says, when we have just Shabbat or just Yom Tov, okay, we're not concerned, we're not overly concerned. Anything could happen anytime. But generally speaking, people are going to do the right thing. People are going to follow the rules. We're not concerned that on Shabbat, a person's going to forget about Kedushat Shabbat. And that's why on Shabbat, if there's a Brit Milah on Shabbat, you still have the Brit Milah. You can do what needs to be done. And we aren't making a Gezerah that somebody might go and do something else. On Yom Tov, we assume that people are going to perform what they're meant to do on Yom Tov. That's why Rosh Hashanah we have mitzvah of shofar. Okay, we aren't worried about that. We won't make extra Gezerah. But what happens when you have Shabbat and Yom Tov? What happens when there is a mix of the 2 days and things start to get confused and people start to get right? People get very, very confused. Is it Shabbat? Is it Yom Tov? What is it? Right? So what's going to happen is when there is a mitzvah or there's a certain characteristic of Yom Tov, and people are so engrossed in performing the mitzvah of Yom Tov that they'll forget that it's Shabbat. You do things the way you normally would do on Yom Tov, and you lose sense of the Kedusha of Shabbat. So that's a place where Chachamim came along and made a Gezerah. Purim, the same thing. If Purim is going to be on Shabbat, and the Shabbat, which is Purim, is just the normal Purim, all the things that we do, so then it's very, very possible, and it's very easy. The person is got the atmosphere of Purim, but they forget about the atmosphere of Shabbat, and therefore they forget. And the message out of this is that we have that Purim has its unique character, Shabbat has its unique character, whether these days fall separately or when they fall together as well. But we have to relate to the unique character both of Shabbat and both of Purim and find the ways to incorporate both of those. Okay, in the coming days, in the coming Shiurim, we'll talk about more of the details of how that works. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer, Tzon Kadosh Baruch Hu, Zakot Yisrael, B'chak B'alem Torah Mitzvot, Lemad Nechvet Tzman Tzukoi, Agdil Torah V'Yad.